This is Lecture 123E, Building Socialism, Part 5, and that's for the series of lectures on the ABCs of Communism that are supporting Volume 7, which will be forthcoming in January, I guess, right, of next year. And so we're going to have 7 volumes in this book. Actually, we're going to have 8, because I'm going to do North America in Volume 8. But let's get on with our topic right now. The 1929 evolution of the Red Army industrial complex and getting the Red Army modernized is the subject I want to take up right now. Arming and equipping the Red Army had been the Bolsheviks' primary task from the days of the Revolution, and this military buildup evolved, as we have seen, through several stages. First of all, initially the Bolsheviks inherited what was left of the Tsarist army that by January of 1918 was about 300,000 men. Now they had been equipped with small arms, rifles and pistols produced in Russia in the arms factories of Kazan and Petrograd. And we have traced the origin of large-scale rifle production by Robert Nobel in the Caucasus in Volume 1. Now then, military factory construction had provided what the Tsar's army could rely upon. However, these factories never produced enough arms for all of the Tsar's soldiers. And this was a function of the A, low level of producibility inherent in these early factory installations, and B, the huge numbers of farmers' conscripts who were expected to pick up the rifle of dead comrades and use them as their own. Russian capitalists have been slow to invest in new and improved machinery in the arms factories because of C, the cost, and because they had already guaranteed Tsarist government contract for what they did produce. So they didn't really have any incentives. Now secondly, in the second stage, the Bolsheviks had to recapture arms factories and get them into production during the Civil War. Then they had to beef up rifle and pistol manufacturers everywhere so that each soldier in this multi-million-man Red Army would have one. During the Civil War 1918 to 1920, the War Commissar Leon Trotsky convinced the Germans to build more factories for him. He did this with large quantities of money spread liberally among the Wehrmacht, General Staff, and the German government, everywhere as appropriate, while the war against Germany was still going on. Now, from the German standpoint, this assistance would produce factories down the road and not have an effect on the war right now, clearing the way for German bureaucrats and generals to make some money right now. With the coming of peace in the autumn of 1918, this German war factory construction in the Soviet Republic for everything from small arms to tanks and planes really got underway. All this construction was also fueled by cash purchases financed from the wealth seized from the Tsarist ruling oligarchy and its church, or cash paid directly to Lenin from the Germans themselves. With the end of the Civil War and the coming of NEP, the Economic Directorate of the Cheka was given the primary task of securing what was needed from the surrounding hostile capitalist world, including what was needed to build even more factories and to further beef up the standing TONE, that's Table of Organization Equipment, of the Red Army. For what slowed things down all along was the inadequacy of the Soviet industrial complex. It was not until 1931 that an industrial complex sufficient for the job, imagined by Stalin and the Politburo, was in existence. Some of the first examples of what could be done were military, the T28 and T34 tanks, and the Sturmovik fighter bombers, as well as agricultural. We reviewed Stalin's emphasis on tractors in his conversation with Richard Sorga and illustrated some problems with the automotive truck and other massive civil engineering installations. And fifth, the T28 tank is another early and important proof of Soviet industrial progress with a military orientation under Stalin's plan. From the time that Stalin took over the tank industry personally in January 1930, until that industry could turn out the best battle tanks in the world was only 3 years. We have seen how that aspect of industrialization progressed, albeit after a rough start, from the standpoint of its #1 customer, the Red Army. But first, cracking the whip, the crisis in the oil field. Now, as the first plant got underway in August of 1928, it immediately became apparent that despite initial reports from party cadre in charge of the Baku oil fields, there was an insufficient supply of oil coming northward. Now, Stalin knew the oil field better than any Bolshevik, now that Krassin had passed away at the end of 1926, and he took emergency measures after a thorough investigation that autumn. In January 1929, Stalin notified oil field managers that failure to meet their quotas of oil produced and any further falsification of dry holes as producing wells would result in mandatory and automatic death sentences. Now, panic-stricken field engineers and middle-level management blamed Second Economy privateers for falsification of records. They demanded that they get the most modern French equipment to log wells before casing them. Stalin agreed, and the Schlumberger brothers were brought from France. Their newly invented technique ran an electrical cable down an uncased open hole and then withdrew it on a spool. At the bottom of the cable was an instrument that rubbed up against the open hole sidewall. The other end of this armored insulated electrical cable was anchored to the ground on the surface. Differences in resistivity of an electrical current being run through this wire line told what kind of sedimentary layers of rock the wire line was touching and what they contained. All sedimentary rocks downhole are wet with oil, gas, and/or water. Luckily for everyone involved, the Schlumberger brothers got better results in Baku than anywhere else in the world where they had tried the technique, and that was everywhere. Now, this was the invention of the modern wireline electrical downhole logging. It meant that engineers would not have to take their lives in their hands every time they had to make a decision about whether to case a well or not. Casing a well means running steel pipe into the well and then cementing that pipe to the surrounding formation. And later years I became a well logging engineer, and I'll just make the comment that every well, the first log taken is one of these is called an electrical log. And then everything after that, well, that's another story I don't want to get off into, but I have written about my experiences in that in my autobiographical series of books, Idaho Smith's Search for the Foundation. Anyway, Stalin brought the Schlumberger family and their entire staff to Russia. Under the brothers' supervision, factories were built to produce the equipment, and technical schools were built to train Russian engineers. This made Russia the technically most modern oil-producing country in the world, and the Schlumbergers the wealthiest family in France. It also allowed a tripling of Soviet oil production over the 4 years of the first five-year plan, 1928 to 1932. Now, this made all the difference in the inevitable oil-based GMP Second World War, now only a decade away. The Red Army always had plenty of fuel, as did Soviet industry. Anne Schlumberger has written a biography about her father and her uncle in Baku pioneering the Soviet oil well logging industry, and I highly recommend it to young cadre. After I had become an archaeologist with my PhD in 1974, and after my 1980 escape from Peru, I also became a petroleum well logging engineer, as I just mentioned, and wrote a textbook on the subject for NL Industries. Consequently, I have a special interest in this part of the most dangerous industrial occupation in the world, the oil field in all its facets, and I have discussed more of these well logging experiences in Volume 6 of the series Idaho Smith's Search for the Foundation, entitled Third Crusade, which you can get at Amazon or from Amazon at Kindle Books. Our free press again. Stalin takes over tank industry, December 1929. In September 1929, 1 year after the first plan began, there was a flurry of expose reports in the pages of several military and industrial journals. The muckraking campaign that had exposed the failures at Nizhny Novgorod overtook the Red Army. This time it was the manufacture of tanks under fire. The Politburo demanded an explanation. 3 months later, in December 1929, independent investigators provided that explanation. Their scathing report concluded that the newspaper exposés were accurate. It condemned the NEC or Vysenko. Therefore, in December 1929, the Politburo delegated emergency authority, giving a blank check to a special team to get the tank industry up to plant standards immediately. War Commissar Klim Voroshilov later said of this report and Stalin's intervention, quote, "The Politburo, and mainly Comrade Stalin, demanded from us to take all measures. He said spend the money, even large amounts of money, run people to all corners of Europe and America, but get models, plans, bring in people, do everything possible and impossible in order to set up tank production here," unquote. That's from War Commissar Clement Voroshilov in 1932. Best tanks ever. In 1933, at the beginning of the second five-year plan, the most advanced tank in the world was the Soviet high-speed BT tank. Technologically, it all began in the year 1931. Then the Cheka got its hands on two of the most advanced Vickers tanks in the British T28. Among many then advanced features, these tanks had independent suspension of the wheels driving the treads on the tanks. This made them much more adaptable to a variety of land surfaces and allowed tanks with them to be closer to the ground with the resulting low silhouette. Soviet copies would have this suspension, plus other features such as much heavier cannon and effectively thicker because it was slanted armor. In 1931 was also the year that Cheka brought two tanks from the U.S. manufacturer George Walter Christie for cash under the table and phony shipping papers as tractors to a tractor end user in Odessa. No other army of the world was paying any attention to Mr. Christie's work, including the U.S. Army. So he was cash short. In fact, the Russians saved him from bankruptcy. Christie's tanks had replaced the leaf spring system of independent wheel suspension with a new form which allowed his tanks to go at much higher speeds with a lower profile. In 1932 and 1933, the end of the first plan and the beginning of the second, across the board, Soviet tanks of three classes were emerging as qualitatively superior to any of the tanks of the capitalist nations. The most important of these was the T28. These first newly designed main battle tanks were produced in three major Soviet factory complexes. However, they were so simple in design as to be buildable in any Auto Works factory. They were secretly produced in several of the new five-year plan arms factories behind the Urals. They became available in large numbers in 1934. The T-28s were by far the best tank in Europe as of 1933. The next question became, can we produce enough of the right types to ensure our victory in the inevitable coming World War? The T28 Tag Series. In 1933, the Red Army adopted these new T28 tanks as its main battle tank. A slightly smaller tank and a considerably heavier one backed it up so that all three principal armor attack tactics could be employed in any battle. In 1937, the T-28 gave way to the then ultra-modern T-34 design as the new main battle tank. The T-28 dropped down to serving the function of mass armor attack in support of the T-34 Vanguard. When compared to the German Panzer series, the T-28 was always an overmatch for them. The T-34 commanded any and every battlefield against any German tanks once they took the field and were too advanced to be comparable to Panzers. The battlefield difference in everyday boxing terms is the difference between a heavyweight fighter and a middleweight. For comparable statistics, we should compare T-28s to German Panzers. At the time, these were the only serious contenders in the armor world, and in Volume 1 I gave the statistics for all of these tanks that would be of interest to military people. In 1937, all T-28s were made submersible to a depth of 4.5 meters through a river over half a mile wide with a downstream force of 1 meter per second or less. By 1 January 1939, the Soviet Union had a total of 21,100 battle tanks of all classes. From September 1, 1939 until the day of the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union on 22 June 1941, the Red Army was equipped with only 1,363 of these best-ever T-34 tanks. Within 6 months of the war's beginning, our factories were kicking out 35 per day, or 1,050 per month. Stalin had hoped to delay this war another year, at least, which would have given him another 12,600 tanks, T-34s. This in itself might well have prevented the Nazi attack, or redirected it elsewhere. Our tank production got right back on schedule in 1942, so that by the Battle of Kursk in early July 1943, the Red Army could literally swamp the attacking Nazi cream and liquidate it, as we did. And there's, you can see there's some good videos on this, on the Battle of Kursk at the series called Great Tank Battles, and you can find it on the internet. I think you can watch it for free. The Battle of Kursk Parts 1 and 2 in northern and southern battles. Well, anyway, the T-34 Tag Series. After the fascist army officers rising in Spain on July 17, 1936, Stalin decided to intervene. The Spanish Civil War produced the long-awaited combat observational specifications of performance, armament, armor, reliability, and producibility that the Soviet government needed. These were channeled from Alexander Orlov in Spain directly to Joseph Stalin. Stalin took the responsibility for seeing that the Soviet engineers in the industrial cities, including the secret ones being constructed behind the Urals, immediately incorporated them in the newly emerging best-ever T-34 tank. Joseph Stalin had given these specialist engineers the exclusive responsibility for improving the main Soviet battle tank, so that in 1937, the first of the perfected tanks, the T-34, in its prototype combat-tested new and improved form, was coming off the secret military production lines. These T-34 tanks featured slanted armor, which effectively doubled the amount of steel an incoming projectile had to penetrate in order to kill the tank crew, but at half the weight of the German tanks. This made the T-34s the fastest tank in the world, which, combined with their heavy guns and Christie-type independently suspended wheels driving the treads, created our de facto invincible main battle tank. Stalin's tanks win the war for us. Stalin went on to build T-34s at an annual rate of over 40,000. By the end of January 1944, when the finalized version came online in large numbers, the Red Army had the best and greatest number of tanks in the entire world, perhaps 100,000 by war's end in May 1945. These tanks and the heavy KZs dealt the final death blow to the Germans at Stalingrad and Kursk, and in each of the ever-increasing number of large-scale battles that forced the Germans back to Berlin in less than 2 years after the 8-day Battle of the Kursk salient from July 5th to 13th of 1943. And again, so you can see great tank battles, Battle of Kursk, Parts 1 and 2, for the details of the Battle of the Kursk salient. Military writers describe this nearly 2-year-long Operation Bagration as the greatest military success story in world history. That began that Kursk battle featured the beginning of that 2-year-long period, and it was less than 2 years before they hammered their way into Berlin. The Sturmovik fighter bomber. Air power was part of the army in all the advanced countries of the time. Of equal importance to Stalin and his planners to the land main battle tank, the T-34 tank for the Red Army, was the warplane called Sturmovik, or Il-2, or Il-2. The Sturmovik was made of metal and wood. The main cabin and engine-bearing fuselage was a one-piece steel unit made of such powerful defensive armor it was virtually impervious to bullets, other than those fired by the very largest cannons. The Sturmovik's rear assembly and rear fuselage was made of wood. This compensated in weight for the heavy armoring of the personnel-carrying frontal steel assembly. Its fuel tanks were self-sealing and impervious to being blown up by the ignition of the gasoline fumes that would otherwise be in this partially empty tanks in combat. In early 1938, the Spanish Civil War statistics and insights gained in the air war over Spanish battlefields led Stalin to hire Sergei Ilyushin. He brought his Central Design Bureau from Moscow's Plant 39 to the forefront in aircraft production. Ilyushin had invented what was called the Sturmovik flying tank. It was his idea of an advanced ground attack fighter bomber. With Orlov's battle stats and Stalin's support, he had all the funding necessary to build and test them and go over immediately to mass production. Soon these fighter bombers were being built in plants all over the Soviet Union. Prototypes flew against the Japanese at Khalkhin Gol. In May 1941, the first regular Sturmovik shipments of 249 planes reached the Red Army. That was just 1 month before the Nazi invasion in June 1941. By the end of World War II against Germany, the USSR had produced over 42,000 Sturmovik air tanks. They were by far the best warplane of any nation during that war, and they ensured the Red Army of control of the air and of the battle on the ground. Now, the pace, 5 and 4. In the first plan's third year, 1931, Stalin decided to wrap it up. That plan was in shreds compared to its structure at the beginning. The slogan 5 years in 4, or simply 5 and 4, spread overnight across the country. Little children ran through their playgrounds that day singing 5 and 4, 5 and 4. Stalin then kicked off the second 5-year plan almost a year early. The first plan wrapped up its loose ends after a total lifespan of 4 years and 3 months. This time, with the second plan, the boss and his plan commissars had a solid grip on the mechanics of central planning and forecasting. Furthermore, despite the chaos of the first plan years, the errors and disasters, there had been tremendous infrastructure progress in heavy industry, machine tools, and heavy and light machinery manufacture, as well as electricity production and oil and gas exploitation. However, on the question of pace, Stalin was persevering. The boss seemed to insist always on the hardest way to go. Why? To maximize the speed and scope of agricultural collectivization mechanization, and to assure the absolute maximum rapidity in the construction of power, steel, machine tool, heavy and light manufacturing, chemical and fuel industries. The pace also became a way of keeping potential opposition from solidifying around anything. By the time a few managers might succeed in getting the Central Committee to grant an audience, the entire equation would have changed, as millions more workers were sent to tackle new targets. For example, hydroelectric power construction, river-linking canals, behind the Urals coal mines, and steel industries. Whatever ill-thought-out practical events had precipitated the manager's audience were now ancient history compared to the new problems emerging by the increasing demands of the boss to increase the rate of collectivization to 100%, pour steel before the walls and roof of the factory are finished, decrease dry holes in the oil field to 0, factories and mines to 24-hour production days, and by the way, this is now 7 days a week, or in the experimental 5-week month, 6-day week, every day of the week. Opposition within the party was there and growing because the pace demanded by Stalin was hard, not only in hours worked, but also under conditions far worse than might have been tolerated by workers from capitalist bosses. Yet Soviet labor proved loyal to Stalin and conformed. In other words, although the pace was oppressive, Soviet labor concluded that what they were gaining made it worthwhile. Not the least reason for this conformity and the belief in it was the 24-hour everyday propaganda campaign conducted in the arts, including motion pictures, the radio, the press, and ad hoc committees. The campaign brought every artist in the country into building a new socialist motherland with posters and graffiti. Now, Trotskyism attacked Stalinism in practice. It was on the question of pace that Trotsky made a principled point of attack against Stalin. Beginning from his 4-year-long exile base on the island of Principe off the Istanbul, Turkey coast, and continuing throughout the first 5-year plan, Trotsky had kept up a drumbeat attack on the Stalinists for the forced pace of the mechanization of collectivized agriculture and the forced installation of everything. The new steel industry, the hydroelectric, machine tool, and massive automobile complexes arising from the bare earth all over the Soviet Union, as at Magnetic Mountain, were his targets. Stalin could have stopped Trotsky cold any time he wished. So I've often used to wonder Why did he let him continue his ongoing assault against everything he was doing, building, and dreaming? And I think now that Stalin found Trotsky's nearby treason to be useful in his political campaign to silence the opposition. Trotsky could not be a very worthy conspirator against the USSR, after all, unless he was alive and shooting off his mouth. Then it would be quite reasonable to jump to agreement with the Comintern line that Trotsky, as a man of action, would naturally be actively organizing all kinds of uprisings and conspiracies against his nemesis, and Stalin had incurred the wrath of his bosses. As Stalin unfolded the trial of the Trotskyite Zinovivite opposition for the murder of Kirov in June 1936, it became apparent the central issue was going to be sabotage of the pace of the 5-year plans. Now, in this limited way, the prosecutors were right. Zinoviev and Trotsky had publicly opposed the pace and made that opposition the center of their political opposition. Whatever Trotsky and Zinoviev had all thought they had been doing with regard to Kirov, the real effect had been to set themselves up to be the principal targets of the most recent Cheka prosecutorial drama. I suspect these two so disrespected Stalin's intelligence they never saw that they were walking away into the sunset of political oblivion. However that may have been, objective observers within the party could see the real targets were going to be anyone with a history of objecting, even quietly, to the pace set by the boss, anywhere, anytime, for any reason he might consider sufficient at the moment. Smart bureaucrats who could ducked for cover and conformed too. The Cheka prosecutorial drama might seem unusual. However, those of you familiar with the modern history of Russian literature will see obvious historiography in the way the trial writers and choreographers worked. The point is, the specifics of the drama were nothing beyond the central point of the stupidity of opposition to the most rapid pace humanly possible in industrial and agricultural and infrastructure construction, not to mention military production. This was the social structural point of the entire trial. It's not our job in this textbook to make moral or ethical judgments on these developments. Prosecutions are often notoriously unfair in all countries, as I can testify from personal experience having dealt with the totally corrupt U.S. federal prosecutors and their cops. It is our job to reconstruct what happened so we can accurately understand what was going on in reality. For more on my experience with unfair prosecutors, I recommend my book Third Crusade at Kindle Books at Amazon.com. Anyway, after 1935, Alexei Stakhanov, the hero of socialist labor. As the Congress of Victors concluded in January 1934, Comrade Stalin proceeded to explain how the pace could be stepped up. The proof that production could be stepped up to seemingly fantastic levels came the next year in 1935, and that thanks to the socialist dedication of miners led by Comrade Alexei Grigory Stakhanov, who had increased coal production by seemingly incredible amounts on their individual shifts. Stakhanov was a highly motivated communist jackhammer operator in a mine in the Donbass, that is, Donetsk Basin of the eastern Ukraine region. The local press had reported he produced 100 tons of coal in 5 hours and 45 minutes, which was 14 times his quota. Stalin read about him and his work and the work of his team. He saw the obvious potential in stimulating the working class with this proof of what they could do when sufficiently motivated. Grigory Stakhanov also convincingly indicated that the old bourgeois specialists had been sabotaging the Soviet economy, presumably in the foolish hope that the Soviet system would fail and be defeated. Thus, anti-Soviet plotters who had dominated the coal capital of the Donbass at Shakhty had failed miserably at the hands of Donbass coal miners. The Stakhanovite movement began during the second 5-year plan in 1935 as a new stage of the socialist competition. The Stakhanovite movement was named after Alexei Stakhanov, as we have seen, who had mined 102 tons of coal in less than 6 hours, or 14 times his quota. However, his record would soon be broken by his followers. On February 1st, 1936, it was reported that Nikita Isotov had mined 607 tons of coal in a single shift. The Stakhanovite movement, supported and led by the CPSU, soon spread over other industries of the Soviet Union. The initiators of the movement were Alexander Busygin in the automobile industry, Nikolai Smetanin in the shoe industry, Yevdokia and Maria Vinograd in the textile industry, Gudov, I.I. Gudov in the machine tool industry, V.S. Muzinsky in the timber industry, Pyotr Krivonos in the railroads, Pasha Angelina, glorified as the first Soviet woman to operate a tractor, Konstantin Borin and Maria Demchenko in agriculture, and many others. On November 14th to 17th, 1935, the first all-union or federal Stakhanovite conference took place at the Kremlin, which emphasized the outstanding role of the Stakhanovite movement in socialist reconstruction of national economy. In December 1935, the plenum, or full meeting, of the Central Committee of the All-Union Communist Party Bolsheviks specifically discussed the aspects of developing industry and transportation system in light of the Stakhanovite movement. The resolution of the plenum said, "The Stakhanovite movement means organizing labor in a new fashion, rationalizing technological processes, correct division of labor, liberating qualified workers from secondary spade work, improving workplace, providing rapid growth for labor productivity, and securing significant increase of workers' salaries," unquote. And, in accordance with the decisions of the plenum, the Soviets organized a wide network of industrial training and created special courses for foremen of socialist labor. In 1936, a number of industrial and technical conferences revised the projected production capacities of different industries and increased their outputs. They also introduced the Stakhanovite competition within factories and plants, broken down into periods of 5 days, or 10 days, or 30 days. The factory management would often create the Stakhanovite brigade or departments, which reached a stable, higher collective output. Female Stakhanovites were rarer than male, but a quarter of all trade union women were designated as norm-breaking. A preponderance of rural Stakhanovites were women, as milkmaids, calf tenders, and field workers. With Stakhanovism, Stalin had the solution to increasing the pace that the regional party bosses at the January 1934 Congress of Victors already considered oppressive, if not impossible. They would soon be replaced, along with all those faint-hearted who had supported them. Total speed-up on the job advocated and enforced by trade unions was Stalin's answer. The opposition was completely cowed. In fact, all opposition was now dead, sometimes literally, not just politically. Just to be sure, there were more trials, public and in camera. The summer soldier Bolsheviks, who had exposed themselves at the Congress of Victors, would be weeded out and unity achieved again for the Workers' Vanguard Party. Which brings us in 1937 to reorganize the military and the military-industrial complex. There was a final phase to the purge of the government, or the party government-state apparatus, in preparation for the next phase of the worldwide class war. It featured many generals from the old days replaced by a new generation of officers. It was this new generation of officers who would win the coming World War II for Stalin. Among the newly emerging general class was George Zhukov, who was given command of the Soviet Far East Military District. You will recall when in Volume 1 of this textbook we last saw Zhukov, he had just become as a cavalry sergeant at Lvov and Warsaw in 1920, after service as a private soldier in the Konarmia, that is the 1st Red Cavalry Army. The military and military-industrial complex purge of 1937 to 1938 brought critical war industries, especially in aviation, up to the most modern par then in existence. As we have seen from the Central Design Bureau, Ilyushin headquarters in Moscow, came what Stalin was demanding, and it turned out to be the most important air weapon of the Second World War, the Ilyushin II or Il-2 or Sturmovik tank buster. This air tank ground attack aircraft, along with the T-34 tank, both came from the early Soviet lead in tank and aircraft design, and that came from the Soviet experience of the Spanish Civil War, followed by the military and military-industrial complex purge reorganization of 1937. The Sturmovik was a mass-produced, heavily armored fighter bomber, as we have seen. An aircraft destined to fly low to the ground in close air support of attacking infantry and armor. It could fly slow enough to do the job on the ground and fast enough to drive off the best German fighters. Imagine a land tank with wings coming at you 100 feet off the ground, firing heavy cannon and 50 caliber machine guns, and then dropping one hell of a bomb. Worst of all, your bullets have no effect. Heavy armor and self-sealing gasoline tanks made the Sturmovik seemingly invincible as the Nazi warplanes and anti-aircraft ground fire found their bullets bouncing off or seemingly having no effect. As we have seen, this weapon was designed and produced according to specifications provided to Soviet industry by Spain-based Alexander Orlov, then placed into industrial action by Joseph Stalin. In other words, these specifications were a direct result of combat experience in Spain. The Sturmovik is the air tank, often called flying tank. Stalin was fighting with Tukhachevsky above. Stalin wanted 20,000 of them. Probably more than any other thing, this single critical issue that led to Tukhachevsky's death. Tukhachevsky wanted a heavy bomber fleet to take the war directly to Nazi Germany in a first strike. For an upside-down interpretation of this fight, see the book, The Chief Culprit, by Viktor Suvorov, published in 2008 by the U.S. Navy Academy Press in Annapolis. However, the personal historical dislike we know Stalin had for Tukhachevsky should not be underestimated in the way the Tukhachevsky affair played out. Stalin would tolerate Kalinin's alcoholism barely because of their old times together. And I think for the same reason, their mutual historical experience, he would cut Tukhachevsky no slack at all. The T-34 Stalin's tanks were designed on Spanish Civil War experience to have slanted arming. Now this doubled the amount of steel an enemy had to penetrate, simultaneously giving the red tanks a heavier punch at half the panzer weight. So that if we just want to if this is a tank, you can see that if a shell hits it like that, that's one thing. But if it hits it like this, it's going to have to go through twice as much steel before, I mean, hitting slanted, by slanting the armor, you're putting almost twice as much steel in front of that shell. Now, these changes in personnel, well, anyway, the red tanks had a heavier punch at half the panzer weight, and the T-34s were very fast, safer with diesel as opposed to gasoline engines, better protected, and with the additional plus of being heavily armed with bigger cannons than any of the Nazi tanks, with the exception of the when they armored the Germans used a tank at Kursk. Oh, they almost all burned up because they were not properly built on the battlefield, but all they were was just heavily armored Field 88 guns. These changes in personnel and equipment perfected the 1938 Red Army Field Manual theory of deep battle. It would soon take on greater importance combating what the Germans called blitzkrieg. The Germans originally learned that tactic from the Red Army instructions of General Tukhachevsky during the early Apollo years. Anyway, the new weapons provided our side with the best tank and the best close air ground attack warplane of the entire coming World War II, regardless of side. In short, the military changes won the war for us. By June of 1941, the Red Army was not only the biggest army in the world, it had 3 times as many tanks and twice as many warplanes as the rest of the world combined. This overwhelming numerical superiority, combined with Stalin's construction of the vast coal, steel, machine tool, tank, and aircraft factory construction behind the Urals, saved socialism when the inevitable imperialist war against the Soviet Union began. Every single aspect of this modern war capability came as a direct result of the 5-year plans. Both the historians of the U.S. imperialists and the contemporary Trotskyists are allergic to the truth in this matter for obvious reasons, and this is why they have given you a totally arbitrary, one-sided, always false version of the particular events known in socialist scholarship as the Tukhachevsky affair, meaning the decision in 1937 to arrest Marshal Tukhachevsky and associates and execute them, which is another story for another time. But at any rate, the pace, part 1. For Stalin, pace was a question upon the compromise, upon which compromise was not possible, although at the end of 1929-1930 harvest and government collection, dislocations because of the pace had forced a temporary compromise to come from Stalin, and he then blamed those underneath him for pushing the pace too far and too fast. In his Pravda article, Dizzy with Success, on March 2nd, 1930, and you can see on Marxist Internet Archive the full document, Stalin seemed to be coming to the defense of the mass of now pathetic capitalist farmers. However, after the grain was in 1930, and the moment the party and police were back in the saddle, the pace was pushed even faster. And by whom? By the boss himself. Experience. Why? Because Stalin had learned as a 14-year-old boy in Georgia, the way to win while organizing strikes and robbing banks was to keep moving so fast the police could never catch you. It kept him out of jail for years. You can see Simon Montefiore's 2007 biography called Young Stalin, which I would urge you to get and to read. Very entertaining and informative book. In the 1904-1905 War and Revolution, he learned the way to beat the Tsar was to keep events moving in front of him and out of control. Stalin found the Civil War, 1918 to 1920, that the way to win was to move troops quickly from one part of the Soviet Republic to another part. He did this using trains and trucks, relying on the telegraph and telephone as opposed to courier dispatches of old, cavalry and dragoons, mounted infantry. It is Trotsky's Red Train, which military historians never seem to fail using as an illustration when commenting on Bolshevism's commitment to modernity in warfare. But it was Stalin who used the railroads more than any other of the supreme commanders. On 30 November 1918, the party declared its 3 supreme commanders to be Stalin, Lenin, and Trotsky, and on that date, Pravda announced the trio as the highest authority leading the Red Army. The party triumvirate led the Soviet Republic as a military camp. Now, at the same time, Stalin was shrewd enough to see the superiority of Boudinny's cavalry when fast and hard-hitting movement was what was needed. Several times he had shown his ability to move a powerful, that is Boudinny's first Red Cavalry Army, across a vast distance, then go right off the march and into combat against superior white or foreign, such as English, French, Polish forces, dealing them death and total destruction. It was the combination of these successes of Stalin's in the Civil War that gave him a much-deserved military reputation among his peers. Stalin's use of working-class Bolshevik regular and political officers gained him political support in the officer class, at least among the Bolshevik portion. Now, Stalin learned during the aftermath of the Civil War how important it was to move extremely fast against the opposition. Whether that opposition came in the form of revolting would-be capitalist farmers in Tambov, where General Tukhachevsky's quick application of poison gas on rebel peasant forces brought about their demise, or mutinous sailors at Kronstadt. There, Trotsky led an immediate attack by the party members in Congress in Petrograd, along with available Red Army forces, liquidating the mutiny before it could gain support. Such potentially lethal opposition could be isolated and overwhelmed by a rapid movement of superior forces against them. The Leninist art of war, deep operations, deep battle. By this time, the idea of speed combined with deep, probing armored thrusts, backed up by close air support for superior infantry frontal assault, was the basis for the new Soviet military doctrine known as deep operations, also called deep battle in the 1936 Red Army Field Manual. This doctrine's first principle was deep behind the lines armor and air attacks to break up enemy formations before they could get their act together, and scatter retreating formations before they could regain their footing. Now, this is exactly the strategy Stalin used against the kulaks and other capitalist elements in the countryside. Deep battle and civil class struggle. Stalin had learned the utility of speed and surgically applied overwhelming force in getting decisive victory once you made up your mind where you wanted to go. Stalin knew what he wanted in Russia: 1. A modernized and socialized, what should have been inherited, capitalist industrial base, and 2. A North American agribusiness structure for socialized mechanized agriculture. It was for this reason Stalin did not compromise on the question of pace. He really could not, without giving his opponents the breathing space they would need to organize against the man in control of the party and its state and government. Nor could he reduce the pace if he really believed what he said, that the USSR had only a decade in which to prepare for the final imperialist world war the capitalists will inevitably unleash. And that brings us to the Congress of Victors, what I like to call wintertime with Stalin, in January and February 1934. During the middle of January 1934, the build-up for the party's greatest Congress since the death of Lenin, exactly a decade earlier, was well underway. For 2 weeks, beginning January 26th, the party's highest officials met in Moscow for the party's 17th Congress. The press was calling it the Congress of Victors. The victors of the Napoleonic Wars in Vienna, as the Soviet press frequently pointed out, held the last Congress of that name in 1850. That time, Russian troops backed up international reaction. This time, in the winter of 1933-1934, Russian troops backed up the world's first workers' government. For Stalin, the outcome was bittersweet. Why? Because while the Congress gave him the adulation he deserved for the great successes of the first 5-year plan, and okayed his decision to launch the second 5-year plan over a year early, you will recall that discontent among the party brass was seething just below the surface. The party rank-and-file faithful may have been thrilled with the boss, but much of the brass felt terribly abused and insecure. One might say that, at the least, the brass was disgruntled. Now, the victors agreed with Stalin's now famous summation speech to paraphrase, quote, "The Soviet Union, which 5 years earlier had produced only 4 million tons of steel, now produced over 6 million tons of steel annually. The Soviet Union, which had the most primitive machine tool building industry, now had a massive and most modern one. The Soviet Union, which had the most primitive chemical industry, now had one adequate to the most modern demands. The Soviet Union, which had no aluminum industry, now had one. The Soviet Union, which had an uncertain supply of petroleum products, now had a permanent supply and transportation system of ships and pipelines. The Soviet Union, which had no electric power industry, now had one, including the soon-to-be completed greatest hydroelectric dam in the world." Stalin pointed out that in the 5 years from August 1928 through 1932, the population in the urban areas had doubled from 16 to 31%. Within that figure, one had to take into account the rapid proletarianization of these cities, with the number of industrial workers jumping from 3,124,000 to almost 8 million. The number of women workers employed in the years of the first plan jumped from 2.795 million to 13.9 million, a jump within overall employment for women from 24 to 39% of the total workforce. By the end of the first plan, the number of workers beginning their industrial careers since 1926 had reached a level of 45 to 60%, according to the specific industry. Industrial production had doubled within these 4 years. Not only had steel production increased over 50%, the production of coal jumped 100%, from 35.4 million tons annually to 64.3 million tons annually. Electricity production to support industrial expansion had tripled, jumping from 5 million kilowatt hours to 14 million kilowatt hours. The list went on and on. and everyone knew that this was the bottom line. They had given Stalin what he wanted and had demanded, and when you stepped back and looked at the results of the past few years, you knew that the boss, for all of his seemingly unrealistic demands and enforcement measures, had been right after all. That also meant he had saved their lives, for if the capitalists succeeded in their inevitable world war against them, the party leaders and cadre would be hung, along with their families and friends. The Wrath of the Disgruntled Bosses, Part 1. On the other hand, the voting went heavily against Stalin where it counted, and this in a Congress organized by the man who had organized every Congress beginning in 1917. His regional bosses were extremely pissed off. The boss finally persevered in the vote count and in the formalities of leadership approval, but it was close run a thing as was possible in those days. Stalin had reason to see treason all around him, and this time within the party itself. The Pace, Part 2. Yes, the Congress of Victors was a tremendous success for the Russian Party, and for the international communist movement too, which saw what came out of the Congress's approval of Stalin's leadership. However, quietly at home, Stalin knew he would face significant opposition from within the party to his leadership. Opposition left over from these early years, as well as from overcoming contradictions not even thought of at the moment. And the boss planned to step up the pace, as we have seen with our earlier discussion of Stakhanov and his revolutionary miners. Stalin had to have managers and bureaucrats to run publicly owned means of production. He and his entire party leadership since 1922 had gone about creating a new class that Stalin now called the classless intelligentsia. Now, by the middle to late 1930s, there were over 10 million of them. Along with the industrial workers and the collective farms, this made the regime very stable. Even so, there was the ever-present potential threat posted by the government that tolerated a second economy of private capitalists. However, as long as active opposition elements were continually weeded out by the secret police, the Stalinist Socialist Age was permanent. Stalin, like all politicians, used pressure against his opposition, and there was an increasing amount of opposition from big regional party bosses commanding billions of rubles in investment capital, and that is opposition to Stalin's breakneck pace of industrialization, not to mention his increasingly heavy demands on the collective farms. Then Stalin announced the law that made death sentences mandatory for oil field managers failing to meet their quotas. These big managing bosses in the party and the mass of de facto petty bourgeois new-class government bureaucrats revolted. This incentive program could spread to them, and it was too much. At the Congress of Victors in 1934, the disgruntled bosses marshaled sufficient votes to name Sergei Kirov, the Leningrad party chief, to be Stalin's successor in the event that Stalin was to die or be recalled. First point I want you to remember. In the official final count voting for party main secretaries, of which there were 4, Stalin got 1,056 votes, and Kirov got 1,055 votes. This made Kirov the official successor. Stalin was first secretary, and Kirov now second secretary, of the 4 secretaries running the party executive. Stalin's title changed again, and he was no longer the general secretary, but now the first secretary. Stalin's official title with regard to leadership had changed several times in the early years of Bolshevik power, and of course he had been given other responsibilities and concomitant titles that went along with them, such as Commissar for Rabkin, the Farmers and Workers Inspectorate, and Commissar for Nationalities. The second point is, then the Congress ordered Kirov from Leningrad to Moscow, where he would be the Moscow party boss. That would put him right next to the seat of power and government in the Kremlin. Third point, Kirov confided in Stalin about the meeting forced upon him the day before the actual voting by disgruntled regional party bosses who wanted him as their candidate. Kirov was perhaps Stalin's closest friend, and he offered to refuse the appointment, but Stalin would not hear of it. After all, with Kirov as his number 2 waiting in the wings, the disgruntled party bosses would really have nothing at all except a person with exactly the same views as Stalin, except a little or a lot more congenial, perhaps more willing to listen and respond positively to well-thought-out arguments. What would be truly dangerous for Stalin was if some cream-puff Bolshevik, quote-unquote, like Bukharin, were the candidate of the disgruntled. With a piece of shit, quote-unquote, like that, Stalin's words, not mine, as number 2, his program and pace would be under constant and immediate threat. Better to have Kirov as number 2, while he figured out how to deal with the disgruntled bureaucrats. How it played out. Kirov continued his close friendship with the first secretary, Stalin's new and most important official title. Stalin urged Kirov to accept the appointment as second secretary and Moscow party boss, and however the party's most important regional bosses had succeeded in achieving one of their objectives, namely, Stalin was warned. He wasn't omnipotent, and the bureaucracy wouldn't stand still for that kind of punishment, just for the radical and seemingly impossible speeds he was demanding in the industrialization of the nation. And that brings us to a conclusion of these lectures on building socialism, and we'll continue the next time with our discussion of the preliminary jockeying for the World War with the war in Spain.